Let us welcome our opening speaker, Tom Jensen, Chief Polling Expert at Public Policy Polling here in North Carolina. Tom has been the Director of Public Policy Polling since 2007. During that time, he has overseen thousands of polling projects, covering everything from presidential and Senate races to county commissioner and school board races. He is the voice behind PPP's popular Twitter account, which has more than 100,000 followers. In 2016, he was named by Rolling Stone as one of 16 young Americans shaping the 2016 election. And after correctly predicting the winner of every state in the 2012 presidential election, he was named by Business Insider as one of the 36 most powerful people in American politics. He is a frequent expert commentator for TV, radio, and other news organizations. A native of Ann Arbor, Michigan, he is an honors graduate of UNC Chapel Hill. Tom, welcome to Politica NC's Election Slam.
Well, thank you all for the opportunity to be with you, and thank you for the good work that you're doing. I'm just going to give sort of a brief overview of the North Carolina political landscape for this year. And it's sort of an interesting situation because I would say that the highest profile elections in the state are on one track, and then the lower profile, but as you all note, very important elections in the state are on sort of a different track. And neither of those is bad news, but I think it just, you'll see that it speaks to how important those activism efforts are at more localized races and state races. So top of the ticket, we have Governor Cooper up by about 10 points in North Carolina right now. We have Cal Cunningham up by about 6 or 7 points in the Senate race. And we have Joe Biden up by about 3 or 4 points in the presidential race. So you would think based on all of that, that things are just going great for Democrats across the board in North Carolina this year, and maybe Democrats can expect to win everything. But what's interesting is that when you then ask people, well, generically, which party do you support this year in North Carolina between the Democrats and the Republicans? It's more like a tie. So you would think that if Democrats are up by a good amount for all that high profile stuff, that they'd be up across the board. But what you have is a situation where in the governor's race and in the presidential race and in the Senate race, Democrats have a clear candidate quality advantage across the board. Roy Cooper has proven to be a very strong and popular governor, especially with his handling of COVID. People don't really know who Dan Forest is yet, at least among the broader population. So because of those dynamics, Cooper has a big lead. Tom Tillis has been unpopular from the day that he took office. Republicans have a lack of enthusiasm about him that's driving his numbers down, even within his own party, whereas Democrats are perfectly happy with Cal Cunningham. So Cunningham has a decent-sized advantage. And I probably don't need to walk through the dynamics in the presidential race, but because of Trump being so unpopular, Democrats have an advantage. But when it comes to the balance of power between the parties themselves, it's really pretty much tied. So when we ask people, who are you going to vote for the legislature this year? It's pretty much a tie. When we ask people who they're going to vote for in most of the Council of State races, it's pretty much a tie. Democrats have a more clear lead for some things like Secretary of State, where Elaine Marshall's obviously an institution, and for State Auditor, where Beth Wood is pretty much an institution as well. But if you ask people how they're going to vote for insurance commissioner or state superintendent, those races where none of the candidates are really that well known or haven't necessarily been on the scene for that long of a time, it's pretty much a tie. And we haven't done a lot of polling on the judicial races, but I would expect that those are pretty much a tie too. And that just speaks to how closely divided North Carolina is when it comes to any sort of race where voters don't know a lot about the candidates. One dynamic that I think is really interesting when you look at the 2016 and 2018 elections in North Carolina is that we think of 2016 as having been such a great election for Republicans for the most part. And we think of 2018 as having been such a great election for Democrats for the most part. But when you look at the legislative vote and when you look at the vote in judicial elections, which really is sort of judicial elections in some sense are the best way of getting the real sort of baseline measure of the balance of power in the state, because voters never know anything about the judicial candidate. So they're just voting for whichever party they prefer. So in 2016, Republicans pretty much ran the table in the key judicial elections. But when you add it all up, they only won the statewide vote 51-49. And then in 2018, when Democrats ran the table in the key judicial elections in the state, they only won 51-49. So that's kind of the difference between a huge election for Republicans in the state and a huge election for Democrats in the state, is just which side wins 51-49, because we are so closely divided that if one side can just get to 51% in the statewide picture, it allows them to win almost all of those key competitive races that are pretty close to being 50-50. So if we could get all the way to 52-48 in terms of Democratic victory in the state this year, we'd really do well in the judicial elections and in the down ballot statewide stuff, even though 52-48 doesn't necessarily sound like that much of a landslide. So I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the legislative situation in the state. As you all certainly know, we have new district lines for this year that are at least a little bit more fair than the old district lines, but they're still not that fair. For Democrats to get control of the state House or get control of the state Senate, they're going to have to be able to win in districts that Donald Trump won by 8 or 10 points in 2016. And of course, statewide in 2016, Trump only won by 3.5 points. So if we had truly fair legislative maps, as long as we could win in places that Trump won by 4 points, that would give us a path to control in the legislature. But that's not the case, because we still have districts that are on average about 5 to 6 points more Republican than the state as a whole. And that means that to get control of the Senate or get control of the House, we have to win in places that Trump won by 8 to 10 points, even as he was only winning statewide by 3.5. Some good news with the state House and Senate picture is that the new Senate maps almost definitely let Democrats pick up two new seats, which would get the chamber to within 27-23. And the new House maps also almost definitely get Democrats a couple more seats, which should get Democrats to within about a 63-57 minority. So that's right off the bat, 2 new House seats and 2 new Senate seats. And we've polled most of the key Senate races and House races that would get Democrats a majority in the House and Senate. And what we're finding is that in those key races that would get Democrats from 57 in the House up to 61, and that would get Democrats from 23 in the House up to 26, and a majority in both of those places, Democrats are only down by 3 or 4 points in our polling. And there's actually some other polling that's more optimistic, but I have to focus on our numbers. Only down by 3 or 4 points in those key races. And there's a couple encouraging things in those key races that Democrats start out only down by 3 or 4 points in. One is that even though there's almost no undecided voters in something like the presidential race, there's a lot of undecided voters when it comes to these key state legislative races. And a lot of the most important legislative races right now, Republicans are up maybe 39-36, with 25% of voters still undecided. So that means that as you all volunteer and give money to key legislative races across the state, there really are a lot of voters still on the fence who can be won over to our side between now and Election Day in these final 72 days. Another thing that's important about the undecideds is that not only are there a lot of them, but they actually, for the most part, are Democratic leaning. When we look at the key legislative races in the state, the voters who are undecided, for the most part, are voting for Roy Cooper for governor, sometimes by double digits. And the undecided voters in these key districts, for the most part, are voting for Joe Biden for president. So the voters who haven't decided how they're going to vote for the legislature yet sort of have a general inclination towards voting for Democratic candidates. But what we have in a lot of these key legislative races are Republican incumbents and new Democratic candidates who maybe aren't that well known at this point. You know, if you're a first-time legislative candidate and we do a poll in your district in August, you're lucky if 15% of voters in your district have even heard of you, and the other 85% say they just haven't heard of you. And on the other hand, a lot of these Democratic candidates who start out with pretty low name recognition are running against Republican incumbents who maybe have been in office for a decade, so they're just better known. So that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because I think when we look at how many undecideds there are in these key legislative races, and we look at the fact that they're voting Democratic for other offices, and we look at the fact that the Democratic candidates aren't that well known yet, that means that as these candidates really execute their campaigns over the next 10 weeks and become better known, voters are really receptive to casting the ballot for those Democratic legislative candidates who are just down by a little bit right now. So hopefully they're able to raise the money they need to really get the message out there about their campaigns. And hopefully there will also be a lot of volunteer energy behind them, because the reality is, you know, it's great to volunteer in the presidential race. It's great to volunteer in the governor's race. But for the most part, getting a phone call or a text or whatever the method of communication might be from a volunteer isn't what's going to move people's votes in the presidential race and the governor's races. They're going to get massive amounts of information about those races. But when it comes to the legislative races, where voters might not know anything about either of the candidates, there's really a lot of opportunity for volunteer energy to help push some of these close districts over the top. I really do think for the first time in the last decade that there is a real path to Democrats getting control in the House and or Senate in the state. It's not an easy path, but there's a path there. And if you'd asked me in 2012, 2014, 2016, I would have said there was no chance whatsoever for Democrats to get a majority in either chamber. If you'd asked me in 2018, I would have said if everything goes right, Democrats might be able to get control of one of those chambers. We actually have a situation this year where the playing field's wide enough that not everything has to go right. Most things need to go right, but there's really about 28 Senate seats that Democrats could possibly win. There's about 63 House seats that Democrats could possibly win. So they don't even have to win all of them to get a majority. There's multiple paths to getting there. So that's my basic overview of the situation in the state. Very good news at the top of the ticket and a lot of opportunity lower on the ticket, where I'm really hopeful that over the next 10 weeks, some of these races that are tied right now or down by a little bit right now, I'm hoping that the great energy that folks like you all are helping to fuel for our candidates across the board is going to be able to help put us over the top in a lot of these really competitive races. So again, thank you for everything that you're doing, and I'll turn it back over.